Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe. I'm your host for this week, and as always, I'm joined by my college friend Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Mark, we won't need any great segues for this opening because it's hot as hell here in New York right now. That heat dome in the south appears to have reached its tentacles up into the northeast. Yeah. And you know what I'm thinking about right now? I think one of the most important and unappreciated, I don't know if you could call it a technical innovation or whatever, of the past century is not nuclear energy or the internet or cell phones or anything like that. I'm talking about air conditioning.
Yeah.
I think air conditioning has probably saved thousands of lives in our country and around the world, especially now that it's getting hotter and hotter. And just wondering if you appreciate AC as much as I do.
I don't often have the opportunity to appreciate it because I'm married to a woman who doesn't believe in it.
Oh.
So we have never had air conditioning in any of our units.
Oh, my goodness.
Which generally is not a problem in Seattle. Generally speaking, temperatures here don't get much above the 80s. So maybe there's a couple of nights during the summer when we just have to suffer through it. But generally speaking, we steer clear of it. So fingers crossed I can keep doing that without any fatalities.
Yeah. Wow. I'm surprised to hear that, but I guess it is doable in Seattle. No, I can't really say the same about New York in the middle of summer.
Yeah. She has a whole philosophy behind it, which is that air conditioning gets you out of the ability to just be with the weather and your body doesn't adapt to it as well. And maybe it's related to the fact that she grew up in Chicago where absolutely everything is air conditioned during the summer.
Yes.
And so that you go into these terribly cold stores and then you go out into baking heat on the street and then you go back into a terribly cold store.
Yeah.
She didn't really enjoy that experience, so she has taken a vow of no air conditioning since then.
Yeah, that's interesting. And of course, also air conditioning is contributing to our warming problem. So
yes, absolutely. Yeah.
You guys are part of the solution, not part of the problem. All right. Well, let's move this conversation a little bit from what cools the air to why we need it cooled in the first place. I'm thinking of that old song lyric, "The weather outside is frightful." And I basically asked you how much more frightful our weather is going to get in our lifetimes, which we both hope will be a few more decades at least. So,
yeah.
As I mentioned when I first articulated the question to you last time, what I've been reading and hearing from climate scientists is that they're not surprised at these particular heat events and weather events that we've been seeing, but they are kind of shocked at how quickly they're coming one after the other after the other.
Mm-hmm.
So my question to you was, what does the long-range weather forecast look like?
Well, thank you for the question. And I will extend your question because you also asked me, is it possible that large swaths of this country will become unlivable within our lifetimes?
Yes, I did.
I want to emphasize that because that was a particular focus of my research. But this has certainly been the summer of extreme weather events. Of course, we had those wildfires in Canada that bedeviled the East Coast with smoke. And likewise, there have been heat waves in Europe, China, and parts of the U.S., torrential rain, again in New York, and really bad flooding in India. July 6, 2023 set a record for the highest ever global average temperature of 17.2 degrees Celsius. So it's been a summer that has gotten a lot of people thinking about extreme weather. And similarly, lots of people are saying all this is a consequence of global warming. Not everyone, mind you, and not just among climate change denialists. There are still holdouts even among those who accept the reality of global warming, such as a man named Cliff Mass, who is a professor of meteorology right here at the University of Washington, and who for years has been waving the flag that climate change only has a very small effect on weather patterns. What you're seeing, he argues, is no more than annual fluctuations. But I'm not going to litigate that issue today. You didn't ask me whether global warming is causing the weather events we've recently witnessed. You asked whether the country might become uninhabitable as a consequence of climate change. So that's where our focus is going to be.
Yes.
And you also, to reiterate, used the phrase within our lifetime. So I looked at things that scientists believe could possibly happen within the next 30 years or so. I don't know about you, Joe, but I don't figure I'm going to live much longer than that.
Yeah, it'll be sad for our audience, but probably true.
Yes, the day the podcast dies. Just an example, projections say that unchecked global warming could cause sea levels to rise by 3 feet by the end of this century through melting ice caps and thermal expansion of the seawater. And that would make coastal cities like Miami and your own New York City essentially uninhabitable. But that's not within your or my likely lifespan, so that sort of end-of-century disaster scenario lies outside the scope of this particular podcast. So with that frame of reference in mind, we can get started.
Okay.
But first, we have to spend a little bit of time considering a different question. To what extent do we even know what the future will hold? When you consider the fact that meteorologists struggle even today to issue an accurate 5-day forecast, you can imagine the difficulty of accurately predicting what the next 5 or 50 years will hold. There's just a high level of uncertainty. We have climate models to project the future of weather patterns, but they have limitations and they're based on assumptions that might prove erroneous in retrospect. And weather is famously complex, with many feedback loops and tipping points that can cause large-scale effects. It's not by coincidence that the famous butterfly effect was coined by a scientist who was attempting to develop a computer model of weather systems. Weather also fluctuates all the time. From year to year, temperatures will go up and down, or there might be more or less rainfall, which makes it difficult to determine whether changes in a given year are part of a long-term, irreversible process or just the way things happen to go this year. Anyone who wants to project the future of climate change has to project whether global emissions are going to go up, go down, or stay the same. They'll have to factor in how rising temperatures might affect cloud cover, which itself would have an effect. High clouds increase warming. Low clouds reflect heat and can have a cooling effect. So your model will need to be able to predict not just how many clouds will form, but what types of clouds will be formed and where. Ocean currents might change in ways that affect regional climates. Ice sheets melting and glaciers splintering will also have an effect. And scientists will need to base their projections on weather measurements that are perfectly accurate because any imperfection will be magnified the farther out the projection goes. In short, it's an enormously complex problem with an unimaginable number of variables, which makes accurate predictions that are also detailed on the local regional level pretty close to impossible. There are some things we know for sure, however. We know that the Earth is getting warmer. We know that ice is melting and sea levels are rising. We know that heat waves, hurricanes, floods, and wildfires are likely to become more common as temperatures rise. And because we are not in denial, we know that all of this is a result of human activity.
Well, some of us are not in denial.
Yes, well, I'm speaking of you and I, Joe. I think we're on the same page. And
Okay,
I would
yes.
imagine the majority of our listeners by now have picked up on the sentiment of this podcast. So the climate denialists are probably not listening. But outside this circle, yes, there is some denial.
Yes.
So to sum up, can I tell you with absolute certainty what will happen as a result of these things? I certainly cannot, and no one in good conscience can. We can, however, talk about some things that probably, or in some cases, may happen. First, let's talk about wildfires. Joe, you have been thinking about wildfires quite a lot lately, probably because of the Canadian wildfires this summer.
Yep.
And smoke from California wildfires has been a regular visitor to the Pacific Northwest for the last few years. None so far this year, ironically, but we usually expect it around September. Rising temperatures worldwide are a significant factor in the increase of wildfires. Higher temperatures lead to increased evaporation, a drying of vegetation, and more frequent droughts, all of which make wildfires harder to extinguish. Despite common perception to the contrary, wildfires have not become more common recently. Since 1983, the average number of wildfires in the U.S. has held pretty steady at around 70,000 fires per year, which is, I would say, an astronomical number, but I suppose it's shocking that there were still 70,000 wildfires back in 83, Even more shocking than that, there are not more wildfires now.
Right. So they must be bigger wildfires, if not more, right?
Yeah. Yeah, what's changed recently, and has changed dramatically, is the severity of those fires, their duration, and the amount of damage that they cause. Rising temperatures can disrupt precipitation patterns and boost insect populations, since some insects thrive in warmer temperatures, and both of those things lead to more dry vegetation that's just waiting to catch on fire. In short, as we previously discussed on this podcast, fire seasons are growing longer worldwide, and as temperatures rise, that could get steadily worse. Next, we come to heat waves. As global temperatures rise, heat waves are expected to increase in frequency and intensity within the United States. Heat waves are already more frequent than they were in the past. On average, there were about 2 heat waves in the U.S. per year in the 1960s, and these days there are 6 per year, and they're also hotter on average. The UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change predicts that severe heat waves that previously occurred once every 50 years will now likely happen once per decade. And there's sort of a feedback loop to heat waves. Hot weather dries out the ground, which makes it easier for the sun to heat the ground, which makes it even more hot. And these are among the factors that contribute to the severity of wildfires. Heat waves also kill people directly, especially the old and sick. On average, more people in the U.S. die from heat-related causes than all other weather disasters. Tornadoes get all the press, but they kill about half as many people as heat waves do. And I remember in my college days reading headlines of the Chicago Tribune about people who had died during hot summer temperatures. That was kind of an eye-opening thing for me. The summers were less severe in Oregon where I grew up, so I just wasn't used to that sort of thing happening.
Yeah, and really, that's why I started this episode talking about air conditioning, because I wasn't joking that I think it's one of the most significant technological breakthroughs in human history. How many lives have been saved by having climate control indoors, you know?
Yeah, having a place of refuge, even if it's just a shopping center that you can go to if the heat is becoming too much.
Yeah.
Heat waves also can damage crops, injure or kill livestock, and cause power outages as heavy demands for air conditioning from people like you strain the power grid. Now, those are 2 examples, and we could go on, but those are the primary concerns within the next 3 or 4 decades, and I think they already give us enough to worry about. What scientists seem particularly concerned about right now is the question whether climate change is accelerating, and if so, some of those end-of-century projections might be closer than we thought.
Right. One of my observations from my reading is, why are the adverse effects of climate change happening faster than anticipated? So I think that's just a different way of saying what you just said about acceleration.
Right. Marine temperatures and ocean acidification, for instance, are rising faster than the models predicted, and the culprit might be feedback loops, to answer your question. Changes in one area create changes in another, which then speed up the changes back in the first area. When I talked at the beginning about the complexity of the system, this is one of the side effects. It's very difficult to model all of those complex interactions. And if you miss out on one or more of those interactions, your models can spit out erroneous or incomplete results. But one thing we can be confident in saying is that there is very little good news in the observational data and a whole lot of bad. So let's come back around to your original question. Is there a chance that vast swaths of the United States will become unlivable within our lifetimes? Despite everything I've said so far, the answer is probably no. If we were Hollywood screenwriters, we might imagine a near future in which sea levels suddenly rise by 3 feet, or tornadoes become so common that the entire state of Oklahoma is evacuated. In fact, I did see some Hollywood movie, and I can't remember the title, where a basic plot point was multiple tornadoes active at the same time within the city of Los Angeles, because screenwriters love nothing so much as to imagine natural disasters in Los Angeles, since that's where they live.
Right, and as you pointed out, a heat wave isn't as sexy as a tornado.
Right. No, tornadoes are so much more visual than a heat wave that, of course, that's what's going to get the screen time.
Yeah.
The reality, though, is that human beings, for all their fossil fuel burning faults, are pretty resilient. You and I might find the Arctic tundra to be completely uninhabitable, but of course the Inuit peoples found a way to live there for centuries. And similarly for the baking heat of deserts. African and Arab tribes adapted to those conditions as well. We may not like what we have to get used to within the United States over the next 30 years or so, but all evidence indicates that we will get used to it and life will go on. Where life might not go on is in other parts of the world, where the standard of living is already just a tick above starvation. And for these vulnerable populations, it won't take much of a change to turn their homelands from just barely livable into not livable at all.
Mm.
And that sends my mind back to when I worked at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and we heard about smallholder farmers in Africa who were just at the subsistence level within an environment that barely supported them and their families. And so if you decrease the water table there, if you increase the temperature, if you increase the frequency of dust storms, it wouldn't take a whole lot to make them feel like they needed to give up on living in that area at all. That, in my mind, is how regions can become uninhabited. I've been talking for a while now about looming disaster scenarios, but despite all of that, Joe, you and I are relatively lucky. We live in the Northern Hemisphere. Rising temperatures will wreak havoc in other parts of the globe before they come for us. On the human level, that is an unmitigated tragedy. It will almost certainly tip off mass human migrations that will make today's immigration controversies look like nothing. But it does mean that the answer to your question is no, but I doubt that you find much comfort in that.
Yeah, I really don't. And I have some thoughts about some of your last points. To your point about getting used to it, I do agree that that is a human capacity and we do get used to things. But do we risk getting so used to it, becoming so inured to extreme weather that we begin not to even identify it as extreme anymore? I think that's potentially catastrophic.
Yeah. Well, it is remarkable what we can get used to. Every now and then I'm reminded of the fact that 30,000 Americans die every year by a single cause, and that causes car accidents. And no one says anything about it because we're just used to that sort of thing happening.
Yes.
So yes, we have the capacity to become inured to things that happen routinely. And if those things are natural disasters, then we'll just figure that's the way things are.
Yeah, and the reason I think that's catastrophic potentially is because I feel like the weather shocks of the past few years might be our last best hope to change public opinion and provoke the kind of massive government action that's really going to turn the tide on climate change,
Mm-hmm.
I thought of a weird analogy that, in the 1930s, as Hitler's rise in Germany didn't seem real to us because we were across an ocean and living in peace in the 1930s. But Pearl Harbor sure did feel real to us because that happened to American citizens in an attack on the homeland. And similarly with this, I feel like we're still kind of in the disbelief phase, complacency phase of this unfolding catastrophe. But these floods and heat waves and wildfires and tornadoes are the shock that's going to shock us out of the complacency. But if we get used to that and start to accept that as the norm, then maybe I'm wrong about that.
Yeah. I have to say, I'm not very hopeful about government action. The people within this country who need to be convinced about global warming are more likely, if they are convinced that storms are coming at a higher rate than they should be, they're not going to go to their elected representatives for solutions. They're going to go to church and they're going to pray. And so it's just kind of like a different way of understanding how you respond to that sort of thing. And then also, if you think about it internationally, it's not that we just need the United States to get its act together, or even Western Europe to get its act together. We need the entire world to get its act together. And there you have scenarios where the famous prisoner's dilemma comes in, where if most countries are cutting back on their emissions, then it creates a competitive advantage for that one rogue country who decides not to.
Right.
And if everyone needs to get in line, it's hard to imagine that everyone, including Russia, including China, including rogue states like North Korea, would in fact get in line. It seems like there would almost certainly be some states that choose not to accept the science or to ignore it or to attempt to take advantage of this opportunity that they're presented. And so it doesn't seem to me like the Paris Accords are the way out of this. I think the only way, if we have any way, is that we are going to miraculously discover a technological solution that will extract greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. And I don't think that that's likely, but I also think it might be our best hope.
Yeah, I guess I would say two things about that. The first is even that solution that you just mentioned, a technological breakthrough, requires government action and government research and development, and then selling it to people as the solution to the problem. But second thought is, and I guess this doesn't really apply to autocracies like China and Russia, but in the United States at least, 50% plus one can get a lot of things accomplished in this country. And I just think my hopeful take on the near future is that the weather shocks us out of our complacency, and then the 50% plus one gets together to pass a real climate agenda, which already kind of began with the bill that Biden passed last year that has hundreds of billions of dollars of climate funding in it, but a continuation of that. So maybe we can become net zero emissions in the next couple of decades. Mm-hmm. And then you hope that capitalism takes it from there, that the countries that are leading in solar panels and wind development and carbon capture and all, that it becomes a race to develop those technologies to make money on them. And it becomes a self-perpetuating cycle,
Yeah, I do totally know. I think this is probably the sort of thing that's not going to be solved by one thing. It'll be solved by 1,000 different things from 1,000 different directions. If it gets solved, I hope that it does for future generations.
Yeah.
And undoubtedly, some of those 1,000 things are things that we cannot imagine at this current point.
Yes.
They will be things that other people, smarter people, or maybe even smarter artificial intelligences figure out for us.
Yes.
And, fingers crossed. There are topics that I personally engage with and topics that I admit that I somewhat avoid engaging with. And the latter category are disaster scenarios where there's nothing to be done. I've shared more than once with friends and family that if there were some huge meteor heading towards the Earth and there's no way to stop it, and when it hits, then all life will become extinct.
Yeah.
I would prefer not to know about the meteor. Let me live my life in peace in the days that I have remaining, rather than spend those days morning, noon, and night worrying about the meteor. And climate change is kind of almost in meteor category right now, in that it does seem like it's a disaster that's headed this way and that we're not doing nearly enough to stop it. And we don't even really have a consensus about what to do about it. And so there's part of me that just wants to think, okay, well, I'm just going to enjoy my life rather than just stay up at night worrying about this sort of thing.
Yeah.
But I do agree that it's an important thing that we do need to engage with. It's just frustrating when you have a topic like this where there just seems so little that individuals can do other than vote for reasonable representatives and hope that enough other people vote similarly.
Yeah, I hear you. I want to get back to something you said a minute ago about technology. Did you read, there were stories in the newspaper recently about developing a new paint color that's so white, it's almost like the perfect white. It reflects almost 100% of the light that hits it. It reflects it back. And they're actually working on refining this paint so that it could be made available to everybody. Right now, I think it's scientists and the military are working with it. But if this could be made available to everybody and we could paint our roofs and walls this color, it would actually do a lot to mitigate climate impact. So that's just one example of the kind of technologies, as you put it earlier, that you and I aren't even aware of right now that might point the way out of something like this.
Yeah, this sense problem. See, I had not heard about the perfect white color. I have heard about the perfect black color, and I don't know if you've seen videos of that. It is eerie. A space that is painted with the perfect black seems like just a hole in space. It is the weirdest thing you've ever seen. So I'm imagining the absolute opposite of that. And that sort of thing is promising. It's a practical solution. It's just a thing that individual people can do to help out in a little way that contributes in the aggregate in a significant way.
That's true, but it does require R&D spending, and it does require the population to be not afraid or suspicious of all science, Right. And that's where the 50% plus one comes in. As long as the reasonable majority remains in control of this country as it is right now, I can see a way to technologizing our way out of this catastrophe.
Right.
This is really off the scope of what I asked you to answer, but while we're on the subject of climate change, I wanted to ask you about this. You made a point about resilience earlier, and I wonder how likely is it that we will eliminate fossil fuel burning and get to that net zero emission in time to limit global warming to the 1.5 degrees Celsius target that the world has set? Do you have an opinion on that?
I don't. I'm pretty skeptical because when I was doing my research, I was not seeing that 1.5 figure anymore. I think people have given up on 1.5. I was saying 2.5.
Yeah.
And 2.5 is just this side of catastrophe because it's at 3 that coasts are flooded with that extra 3 feet of sea level.
Right.
And cities like Miami and New York are uninhabited because the tide washes over the streets. So yeah, that seems kind of bleak at this point, unless by some magical means we figure out a way to reverse what's going on.
Yeah, well, the U.S. and the European Union has pledged to get to net zero emissions by 2050. And I believe China 2060, India 2070. And now the debate is whether that's not soon enough.
Yeah.
Whether it needs to be more like 2040. Which will take the kind of political cooperation and United Nations magic that I agree with you is probably not forthcoming.
Yeah.
One more thing I want to ask you, and that is to your earlier point about feedback loops. Do you think we've reached some kind of tipping point for irreversible climate impacts? It just seems like what's going on now, what I was remarking on at the beginning, all these things happening at the same time all over the world, so much faster than scientists were predicting, just seems like some kind of tipping point was reached. And that's the kind of thing that scientists will be able to answer someday, but because we're in the middle of it, it's probably going to take 10 years before they say, oh, yep, 2023 was the tipping point.
Yeah.
But I just want your impression of whether you think we've reached some kind of tipping point, because that would sure explain the pace of what's been going on around the world.
I mean, the most accurate answer is that I don't know. I will say that most of the voices I encountered when I went out looking did not speak of a tipping point. And like you said, in order to really separate out ongoing trends from seasonal fluctuation, you do have to wait a few years. So the fact that this was a bad year doesn't necessarily mean that it was a tipping point. It may have just been a bad year. And we are going to have to wait to see it. I personally don't like the term tipping point because I think it gives people a reason to give up. I prefer a more hopeful outlook that energizes people about taking action. For instance, there was a piece in The Guardian which was all about how the climate disaster is already here, and it was written top to bottom from the framework of, well, that's it, we're done. And I really kind of wondered the point of that, because a lot of work went into an article which seems to have just been intended to make people angry and discouraged, and those don't feel like the most productive emotions in this current time. We want people to be focused on solutions rather than looking at the situation with regret and recrimination.
Yeah.
So just for that reason, I tend to avoid the idea of the tipping point.
Yeah, that's a good strategy for sure. And, I'm also hopeful, to reiterate something I said earlier, the investment in this sector is so robust now, the fact that solar power, wind power has become more affordable than fossil fuel burning is itself a sign that the world is mobilizing with the profit motive, of course, but nonetheless mobilizing to face this challenge and that we can innovate our way out of this mess we created. I do believe that.
Yeah. I mean, if capitalism is going to rise to the rescue, it's because global warming has created a path to profitability for companies that provide solutions for this. And so let's go capitalism.
Yes, precisely.
Come on, big business.
Yes. All right. Well, I guess I am heartened that your answer to the big question about the country becoming unlivable in our lifetime is probably no. But I'm still nervous about whether that is partially a function of people getting used to what would have been considered 20 years ago as unthinkable, you know? Yeah. People just get used to that, and that's why they're able to live in a country that's baking under a heat dome for half of the year.
So is that your explanation of the Arab peoples, is that they just got used to all of that sand and sun and dealing with camels, and they didn't like it, but they just got used to it?
Yeah. Well, that's a subject for a different podcast, but
True.
Some people are homebodies. I like to stay close to home. And if your civilization arose in the desert, I think it's natural to want to stay there. It might be that simple, the explanation for why they stay there.
Yeah, particularly since your home has air conditioning, and that is now your favorite technological advancement.
Right. Yeah. Okay. You've got a question for me for next time.
I do. So there was a recent news story that the president of Stanford University is resigning his position as a result of a scandal over manipulation of research data within a lab that he was running. This is just the latest example of a depressing trend. Lots of scientific papers published in reputable journals use data that is partly or entirely fraudulent. One recent study within anesthesiology found that 44% of published papers contained, quote, impossible statistics, incorrect calculations, or duplicated numbers, unquote.
Oh, Jesus. Thanks for telling me that now when I'm about to go under anesthesia for my colonoscopy.
Oh, dear. Bad timing. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
The conventional explanation for this is that the pressure to publish within the scientific community is so high that it encourages academics to publish papers whether or not they have the evidence to back them up. So this is my question for you, Joe. How bad is this problem? Is this just an embarrassment to academia, or should we be concerned that nearly half of all modern scientific data might not be scientific at all?
Wow, that's an interesting question, Mark. My first thought, and this is something I'll probably track down when I research this, is how do these people think they can get away with this? You know, if academics is all about peer review, and how could you publish false data and possibly think you get away with it?
Yeah, well, I mean, bear in mind that these were published articles, so they got past the peer review stage. It was only when people went back to their papers later that they noticed the inconsistencies.
Yeah.
So that's, I guess, part of my question.
Yeah. Okay, well, I will answer that question and come back to you in a couple weeks.
Cool.
And in the meantime, folks, you can find our Mansplaining podcast pretty much wherever you listen to podcasts. Apple, Google, Spotify, Amazon, our home site of Buzzsprout, and many others. If you haven't listened in a while, please check out our growing library of content. If you want to engage with us, you have a couple of options. You can go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast, where you can like us, check our sources, leave us a comment or question, give us a 5-star rating. We'd be especially keen on that if you like what you heard. You can also call us at 206-486-4074. Leave us a voicemail message with your question or comment. And if you call in the next 30 minutes, folks, we'll send you a set of Ginsu knives.
Yes, they sharpen themselves. No,
Not really.
And besides, it's within 30 minutes of recording this podcast, which will be long over by the time we publish it. So
yes, so that's our built-in
this is a false promise.
Fail-safe. Yes. It is time for this episode to end, though. So that's all for now. That was Mark, and I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you then. That's it for this edition of Mansplaining. Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Thank you for hanging out with us for a little bit, and we'll see you next time.